Well, welcome to a letter from First Lieutenant Walter Sutherland, a Virginia War Memorial live stream, Learning from the Home Front. Since 1956, the Virginia War Memorial has been dedicated to the mission of honoring veterans, preserving history, educating youth, and inspiring patriotism in all. We hope you will enjoy this evening's presentation and continue your interest and support of the Virginia War Memorial's educational programs. Tonight, Henrico County history teacher Jim Dorton will share his pilgrimage to discover the story of his great uncle, First Lieutenant Walter W.D. Sutherland, a B-17 pilot who was killed in World War II. Mr. Dorton was graciously awarded a grant known as the REB Award for Teaching Excellence by the Community Foundation of Richmond, which allowed him to travel to England, Germany, and Austria to discover more about WD's service and his death. This presentation will honor the service and sacrifice of First Lieutenant Sutherland and is a story of discovery, family, and loss. If you have a question during today's presentation, please feel free to submit your question using the chat feature throughout the presentation. They will be answered at the conclusion of the program. We have also been experiencing some connectivity issues. If a disconnect occurs, please stay on the page until it reconnects. If it does not reconnect, you will receive an email from the Virginia War Memorial with instructions. Now, let's hear from Mr. Jim Dorton.
All right. Thank you very much, Kendall. And I'd like to first thank the Virginia War Memorial for this great opportunity to honor my great uncle and honor all the individuals whose name appear on the wall at the Virginia War Memorial. I encourage everyone to go out and visit the War Memorial, either if you or your family have or know someone there, or even if you don't. It's well worth the trip, and it gives you something for sure to reflect on. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully tell you a story here today. Just a second here. There we go. About my great uncle. And I call this a letter from D. And that's a picture of me in the Austrian Alps. My great uncle, Walter Sutherland, was a B-17 pilot who was killed in a crash in the Alps in 1945. And as Kendall said, I was lucky enough to be awarded a grant to go and visit the crash site. A little bit about me, very little. I'm a history teacher at John Randolph Tucker High School in Henrico County. And I've always, even since I was a boy, had a deep interest in history, United States history in particular. And even more closely than that, World War II. And that has a lot to do with the fact that both of my grandfathers served in World War II. On the left is my paternal grandfather, Jim Dorton, and on the right is my maternal grandfather, Robert Chilcott, who was a tanker in Europe during the war. And so I have always had an interest in the war. I always looked at these two men as heroes, superheroes, really. I idolize them and have been intensely proud to be their grandson my entire life. And, which brings me to my next point. They were blessed to have that opportunity, to have children, to have grandchildren, to have a family, and bring them up in the United States, the post-war United States, which really, in a lot of ways, was a golden age for our country. Having come out of that war, compared to other nations, in very, very good shape, and they were able to do those, all those wonderful things with their family. And there's so many men that did not get that opportunity. The men that had to sacrifice their all. In World War II and any war. And this story is about one of those men. It's my great uncle, my grandmother's brother, Walter Sutherland, who was killed in the war. And I never knew the man. So over the years, I knew about him, but I never had the privilege to meet him. And here's a picture of D at home on leave before heading off into Europe. He's dressed, of course, in his U.S. Army Air Forces uniform there. And as I said, there's a picture of me as a lad. Even as a young boy, I knew that I had a great uncle that was a pilot, and I knew he had been killed in the war. but I was never told anything else. I didn't know if he was a fighter pilot, a bomber pilot, transport. Did he fight in Europe or the Pacific or Africa? All that I knew, at least that I can remember, is that he was a pilot and he was killed in World War II when his plane crashed into a mountain. And that's as a boy, that was all that I really could remember about this and so forth. And that curiosity about his story is something that always stuck with me. But it wasn't until really a few years ago that I had the time and the opportunity to follow up on that curiosity. We were at a family reunion in 2019, and my Memaw, which is my father's mother, word for grandmother, Memaw, she brought a letter with her to give to me that her brother had written to her in April of 1943. And when I read this letter, I obviously had some questions and so forth, and learned that D was a B-17 pilot and had again been killed during the war. And let me tell you, when I read that letter, it just opened a door of curiosity for me. I just started reading everything I could, trying to find out what unit was he in, how was he killed, everything. And it's a journey that I started 5-6 years ago, and have no intention on ever stopping. I'm constantly looking for new information, not just about D or anything else, just the war in general, I would say. So on the left is Memaw. She unfortunately is no longer with us, having died about a year ago now at the age of 98. But in talking to her more than ever the last few years, which I treasure deeply, that opportunity, talking to her about her brother, about his life, about her life, back before the war even started. It was like talking to her as she was when these events happened, which is Memaw on the right there. Her mind was just as sharp as a tack all the way up until the end. And, as I said, I'm just very grateful to have had that opportunity. And I'm, again, grateful to share what she shared with me, which most of this story is from her memory. So like I said, the letter inspired a very deep curiosity. I could not get enough. Every book I could get my hands on, I'd read it. I'd stayed online, just researching and we emailed people and met people, went to museum sites, and just really started to do what I could to gather the information about the war, about the air war. And then this happened. This is a calendar. It's March of 2020, which was COVID. And as I said, I'm a school teacher, and I usually stay right busy during the school year, grading papers and lesson plans. I also coach sports, and I just don't have any time to devote very often to the things, outside interests like my research on the war. And when we shut down there for a while, I had the time, and I used it. I used every single minute of it that I could. And so I learned all about, as much as I could anyway, the Sutherland family, the war. And what you see here, this is the Sutherland family. Walter Sr. is the father, and Irene Hartsock Sutherland is the mother. Here in the background, you see W.D., and then the little girl here, that's my Memaw, Fern Sutherland, and her sister, Hazel Sutherland. And so in talking with Memaw, I learned all about the family and what life was like back in the 1930s, where they lived, a place called Castlewood in the southwest of Virginia, right? Castlewood, Virginia, a little small town, rail town in the heart of coal country up there in the Appalachian Mountains. This picture here. Here's a look at the town as it was. I'm going to show you a picture I have of a more recent picture, but if you can't see the details all that well, you'll notice a few things. The most important, I think, of which is the railroads. Railroads are really what breathed life into the small towns. Back in that day and before. Railroads brought people and commerce and just about everything in to those areas. And Castlewood was a neat place. Like I said, it's in the middle of coal country, and that brought a lot of people in and out. It's in the middle of farm country, and they would have, Castlewood would have, for example, they had a turkey day, where farmers would, I guess, they would herd their turkeys, down to the town, to bring to the traders that would be down there at the depot, and that's what would bring commerce. And the little town grew up around there, and outside of the town is where the Sutherland family that were lucky enough to buy a plot of land. Not a large farm or anything like that. It's sort of like a neighborhood that they had. They called it Rose Hill, and Walter was able to buy a little parcel of land there and have a house built on it. The house was actually also brought in by the railroads. It was a craftsman home. Sears and Roebuck they'd sell everything, the Amazon of that day, and you basically could order a house from Sears, a craftsman home. They'd ship it in on the railroad. You'd hire a crew to assemble it on your land, and let me tell you, they did a good job, because that house is still there, still standing there, and people still living in it all these years later. Probably coming up to 100 years now that's gone by. So just a neat little town. Back in its heyday, a lot of activity, kids everywhere. Walter was the postman in the town, and he had his little post office right down there at the depot in the heart of the town. And everybody knew him, just a good fellow. Apparently, we'd take the kids out and take them to go get ice cream. Another town over called Lebanon. You'd always have treats for them. And just Memaw said that when she went to her class reunions all through her life, that people always commented what a good man Walter was to all the children. There really are, Walter and Irene. And as I said, Walter was the postman, and when he started his career, he rode on horseback. He delivered the mail on horseback, and I got a story about him that he'd carry a hammer, and he'd have to cross rivers, and he'd use that hammer to knock the ice off his stirrups. So it was just, eventually he got a car and was able to do it that way. But in those early days, that's the way life was out there in that area. It did not, the Appalachians, that part of the country, just did not, I would say, modernize as quickly as some other areas of the country did. And Walter would take his son with him, on some of his mail trips, and he just loved his son so much. His firstborn, he'd take him with him, and if he needed to change him, he'd just go on into one of the houses. Everybody knew each other, and they loved Walter. Apparently, he'd deliver the mail, but he'd also deliver the news. He'd get a couple of people that get newspapers. He'd read them and tell everybody what the news was going on in the rest of the country, because you didn't have television. You certainly didn't have the internet, and not everyone would even get the news. So Walter was a pretty well-known fellow back in those parts. And Irene was a stay-at-home mom, and Memaw said she was the best seamstress in Castlewood, and made all their clothes by stitching them and sewing them up, and was just the best cook there ever was, according to Memaw. And they kept pigs, and they kept chickens, and they had a cow, or they got their milk and all that. It's just such a neat, just a neat way of living there. They didn't really want for anything. Walter kept a garden, and the neighbors had an orchard, and even the cow, they had Irene had a little thing she bought from Sears where you hook it up to your washing machine and it makes cream for you. So it was pretty self-sufficient. Anyway, talking about D, he was an unusual little boy. He had it full of dreams and full of mischief. And, he loved flying. He loved flying from a young age. Memaw tells a story where they get together, the Sutherland family, and they'd have to drive a couple towns over to go to the movies on Saturdays. They'd watch the serials and watch the movies. And I did some research on it. One of the movies apparently was so realistic. When a plane came flying out toward the screen, D thought it was real and ducked and hit his head on the chair in front of him. And apparently from that day on, all he wanted to do was talk about flying, and of course on your right, you see Charles Lindbergh, who was Lucky Lindy, the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic. And every if not every boy in the world, certainly every American boy wanted to be Lindbergh, and be a pilot. and D was no different. That's just all he ever wanted to talk about. So, like I said about Walter and his son, they said there was just nothing in the world like that boy. And D had all kinds of stories growing up, and his buddies, and they had it made. They had a nice little small town life. They all lived in a little neighborhood together. The Sutherland family had a farm about 5 miles away. Sometimes they'd walk, and even D would drive when he could reach the pedals. He'd drive to the farm. Didn't need a license or anything like that back then at that time. Just really lived a neat boyhood, I would say, getting into all kinds of stuff. And one story that's just really amazing. Apparently, D had a dream as a boy, and he told his mom about it the next day. And he said, hey, in the dream I was a pilot, but I crashed into a mountain, and the plane blew up, and it killed him. And Irene just worried herself to death about that afterward. But that he had that dream as a boy. Really quite an amazing thing. D was into everything. He ordered a petting zoo, right? And again, I want to just make sure you understand. There's no internet. There's no phones. The railroad would bring things in. You'd have to write companies and things, write letters and so forth. And he found a way to write in and order a petting zoo. And when they came into town and someone came up to Big Walter and said, hey, there's a petting zoo here for you. And he said, well, that's got to be my son. And he did. He brought it up, set it up in the yard, and all the kids enjoyed it. And I guess Big Walter paid for it, though. He ordered little D. He ordered humming pigeons, and taught them how to fly and come back to them and things like that. One of my personal favorite stories about him is, again, as a young fella, one of the local farmers was clearing some land, and you have to clear out the land and stumps and stones and things like that. And he hired D to get out there and clear the stumps off the land. And apparently old D got out there and just about broke his back every day. He had a moment clearing out them stumps, and he got paid, and he made a good little bit of money. And what he did with it was he bought his mom, he bought her an end table, and he bought her an iron. He did all that work, and he did it for his family. That's the kind of boy he was, and that's the kind of man he became. Later, again, there's no directions. Using scraps, I suppose he'd collected them from the town. He built a Ferris wheel, a small one, but a Ferris wheel for the children of the town. They had it in their yard. We don't have a picture, unfortunately, but Mama's described it many times. She said there's a little hickey you'd use to open and close the door and everything. And he bought a Ferris wheel that he built, and the kids all came and talked about it. And everyone knew him, and just loved the boy. And so he's just a unique little fella who grew into a older fella. This is a picture of D in high school, and Irene here, and unfortunately, around 1938, Irene got cancer, and she did pass away. And Memaw, they didn't tell her. Memaw was at the time, she was in her 12, 13 years old. It's a tough time for anyone, obviously. I mean, tough to lose her mother, but that age is very difficult as well. And they didn't tell her until right about that time, and tried to keep the family going as they could. And Memaw remembers D holding up his mom in bed so she could pray right before she passed, and just tears, streaming down his face. And when she did pass, it was about the time D got out of high school, and he stayed. He had dreams to go off. Like I said, he wanted to be a pilot. He had found a college he was going to try to go to, but he stayed. He worked 2 jobs, and he helped, as best he could to keep the family going. And he did, teaching Hazel and Memaw both, teaching them things like how to drive and buying clothes for them and doing all those things that he could to keep the family going. And he did that for 2 years. But his dream was calling, and he sat down, he and his dad at the kitchen table, and Dee said, hey, I want to join the Army Air Corps. And his old man said, you're old enough now. You got to make your own decisions, and you got to make your own choices. Memo said it wasn't 2 weeks later they drove to Roanoke and D enlisted, into the Army Air Corps, September 17, 1941. And of course, not all that much later, we had December 7th, 1941. And, D went from enlisting and doing so to become a pilot to this enlistment became, going into the Army Air Corps to defend his nation. And this is something that he absolutely wanted to do. No question about that. So with my research, I continued to look. Memo gave me all the story. It was just the tip of the iceberg about life in old Castlewood I shared with you. But through my work, I found the American Air Museum in Britain, and that identified the plane that he was in when he and his crew crashed. It was a B-17-44-8149. And this Air Museum in Britain, the American Air Museum in Britain, is fantastic. They honor our guys there. They have, if you go to their website, they have them all on there. It's just unbelievable. It's a very touching thing to see. I found that D was in the 94th Bomb Group, and also that air base, Rougham Control Tower in Bury St. Edmunds, England. It's a museum. I found that online, and they have a great staff there, and they put on all kinds of programs that commemorate the 94th Bomb Group. They commemorate the World War II era, American soldiers, the British soldiers. It is a very neat place. And I tell you, when I saw that picture right there of the control tower, I vowed, I said, I don't care what it takes. I got to get there. One of these days I'm going to get there. So D was in the 410th Bomb Squadron when he went over. Results count the 94th Bomb Group's logo there. It's more that I found, and I kept my search going. Learned about aviation cadet training, which it is pretty difficult to research. United States was not, I would say, altogether prepared for entry into World War II. And especially the air war, for various reasons. We had to sort of do it on the fly to get the numbers that it took to win that war. And the cadet training it's really a magnificent story. They had to farm out a lot of it to private aviation instructors, but the Air Corps very quickly established their bases, established a very rigorous training program, the screening program. They wanted the best of the best. They only wanted volunteers, and to make it as a pilot or a bombardier, any of them really, you really had to be the best of the best. And that in itself is an amazing story. How our country, our government, our military was able to go from being a peacetime nation, especially when we're looking at aviation, to training thousands of air crew, not to even mention building the ships that it was going to take to win this war. And we were able to do that, I think, in a relatively quick amount of time. So D did his training, and this is in Texas. He was finishing his primary flight school. You see there, he's a sergeant, and the family went to see him. That's Memo on the right and Hazel on his left, and Big Walter, got in the car, and they just drove right on down there to see him finish his primary school. And, they got off of school. Memo did. Memo was still in high school. And reason is because their neighbor was the principal of the high school. And the principal's son was also at the same location. It was also became a pilot. And so he said, yeah, go on down there and see them. And they did. And that was a visit that they remembered fondly. And they took with them Dee's sweetheart. This is Betty. And, Dee and Betty had been seeing each other before he left and so forth. And they kept in contact, and eventually they married. One of those, many thousands of marriages right there before the war. These young people, not knowing what tomorrow is going to bring, they seized the day. They married oftentimes at these young ages and started their families, which Dee was no different. So here's Betty. This is back in Castlewood, living with the Sutherlands. This is Betty, and she's holding their daughter Dolores, who was born in 1944, born out in South Dakota when D was stationed there. And so there they are, living in the Sutherland home during D's service in Europe. So the letter from D, this is, it's got a lot of neat things in it. This was what stood out to me. I'm going to read it to you. It says April of 1943. From what I understand, D was pushing for a combat position. Now, this is before he was a father, but he was pushing to be sent over to Europe as soon as he possibly could to fight. And here's what he said in this letter. He said, I see and hear things that you as the public would never be permitted to see or hear. It's too awful. I've seen girls no older than you that were brought from conquered countries and shown especially to us so we would know what we were fighting for. Those sights kind of made me forget about hot or cooked food or a warm bed or my life. Instead, I was thinking of you and Hazel and Betty and vowing to myself to help put an end to it to the best of my ability and as soon as I can. And that is why I am going across just as soon as I can. And that's what D wanted to do, right? He wanted to get over there and he wanted to serve his country. He wanted to defend his country, his family, as well as his, as his future wife. Just a quick aside, what's going on at that point? Well, this is a little bit later. They called it Black Week. This is October of 43. Our bombing campaign, strategic daytime bombing, is what the United States pushed very hard for. It's very dangerous. Our bombing campaign did not get off to a good start. The casualty rate was very high, almost to an unacceptable level. They actually, they shut it down for a little while and debated leaving daylight precision bombing and going more to the British model of nighttime bombing, more of, I would say, an area bombing. But in 1 week, 148 bombers were lost and 1,500 aircrew. Each bomber, B-17 bomber, had 10 guys on it. So you lose one bomber, that's 10 guys. And in this part of the war, we have not been able to train and equip enough people. You're going to see some very big changes, later in the war. But it was getting to the point that it was unsustainable. But this was the decision of the United States military and the United States government, was to do strategic daytime precision bombing and to destroy the Nazi regime's war-making abilities. And you can't say that the bombing was pinpoint and precise, but the attempt was made to do that. But it came at a very, very high cost to those brave men that were in these airplanes. As they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And I found this quote. It says, "We began to wonder if they were trying to kill all of us." This is from an airman. And he's not talking about the Nazis. He's talking about his own leadership by sending them on these missions. These bombers, flying fortresses. The doctrine was pre-war that the bomber would always get through. No matter what, these bombers, with all the machine guns and so forth and flying at such an altitude, they would be able to fly through the defenses and deliver their payload. And in the end, they could, but they did so at a very high cost. The technological changes were going to be necessary to ensure their survival. And those just were not in place in 1943. So D goes over. This is a B-17, the big square A, the 94th Bomb Group. And this is what he's been training on, and this is what he's going over to fly. And he goes over by ship, across the ocean in February of 1945 and makes it to England. It's amazing to me. He's a pilot and he's on a ship. It was attacked by a U-boat, but the ship survived. And he made it over there to England in February of 1945. Interesting time in the war. On your left, you have Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And this is the Yalta Conference, where essentially deals are being made. Stalin has pushed into Eastern Europe and is on the outskirts of Berlin by this time, and wants his own sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And this, of course, is what's going to help bring about the Cold War. Roosevelt, as you can look, if you look carefully, he's near death here. This trip is about going to be the last thing he's going to be able to do. He's trying to keep balance in the world. He's looking forward to a post-war world that will be peaceful. And of course, Churchill, who is campaigning, more or less for England's place in the world, the British Empire, which has been largely broken by this war. A couple of days after Roosevelt left, in the middle here, this is the bombing of Dresden that took place in February 45. A couple of days after this, and this was a bombing that was just awful. This was the incendiaries were used by the British to set fires in this town of Dresden, which was largely untouched by the war. This is a city that's in the eastern part of Germany, and it was, so they say, crucial for a movement of troops and so forth to the Eastern Front fighting Stalin. And Stalin wanted the place attacked, and it was attacked. And it was done so by such an extreme nature that some say that this was a way to send Stalin a message that, the Anglo-American command is pretty mighty and can do these kinds of things, and sort of to manage Soviet expansionism. However you look at it, the firestorms that were caused there killed tens of thousands of civilians, and this is what the World War II had become regarding the air war during this time. And then on your right, this is Iwo Jima, of course, and so February of 45 in Europe, it's the end, but in the Pacific, looking back on it, yeah, it's near the end, but they had no idea at that time that it's the end. Estimates were we would be there another year and a half, 2 years, that we would have another 250,000 casualties in this war. The atomic bomb was not yet ready. And, going back to Yalta, Roosevelt wanted the Stalins and the Soviets help in this war in Japan. So, when D got there, this is the world situation. It's a very complex one, but his mission, his mission was simple: carry out these bombing raids. And there's his crew. Right. And there's D. I've circled him in the middle. As you can see there, this is a crew of 8. By this time in the war, the air war, the tide had turned. We did not need to take as many crew for the machine guns because the United States had won air superiority. So this is a crew of 8 that was over there. 7 of these men will be on the plane when it crashes in a few months from this time. There's D in front of the B-17, probably getting ready to fly on one of his missions. I found his missions through, there's a 94th Bomb Group has a Facebook page, and the amount of information you bring together, all these enthusiasts, the amount of information they have is phenomenal. And so I was just so grateful to get this. But I want you to reflect on it for a second. Look at the dates, to be sent overseas, put on base and so forth, and to be sent day in and day out. These are missions to Germany. By this time in the war, we are striking at the heart of Germany, not runs into France or anything like that. These are the deep into German territory, hitting, oftentimes hitting industrial targets, trying to finally break the German war machine, oil, factories, things like that, including a mission on March the 18th to Berlin, as they called it, the Big B. But reflect for a moment that often these fellows, they'd wake them up around 3 a.m, say, hey, you got an hour before briefing or before breakfast. They go and they'd eat their breakfast. They go to briefing. They go out and get in their plane, make sure everything's good to go. They would have to taxi. They would have, they would take off and circle in the air, all of which is exceedingly dangerous, especially in the cloudy situations that were often the case in England, and then form up and head across to Europe, where people are trying to kill them on the way in and on the way out, and then land. And to do that every day, it's definitely a young man's game. So the mission to Berlin on March the 18th, 1,329 bombers and 733 fighters of the United States 8th Air Force formed up over England and headed over there. I've given you a picture of the P-51 fighter, one of my humble greatest fighter of World War II, with the detachable gas tanks that they were able to fit to these planes that allowed they called them the Little Friends, these planes to fly with the bombers all the way into Germany and all the way back. And that is how the U.S. Air Force broke the German Luftwaffe. It was these planes and those tanks and the escorts and the way that they ran the missions. They would let these planes leave the bomber formations and just hunt for targets of opportunity. And they basically just chewed up the Luftwaffe, killed the Luftwaffe's best pilots, and the pilots couldn't be replaced. The planes were, but not the pilots. And this was the largest wartime raid on Berlin, and it was to support the Russians. The Russians were doing the groundwork in that part of Germany, and the Americans and of course the British were doing the work from the air. So just imagine looking up and seeing 1,300 bombers and 700 fighters flying overhead. Essentially 12,000 men in these machines flying overhead. It just gives you an idea of the might of the United States armed forces at that time, especially considering when the war started, it was relatively modest in comparison, but still dangerous. Okay. Here you see a bomber, the big square A, delivering its payload, but it's been hit by flak, German anti-aircraft fire. And, this was still a very deadly game. And, this plane, maybe it could return to England, maybe not, maybe make it even to occupied territory. But if they had to bail out, there's no guarantee of safety. Oftentimes, these bomber crews would not be, welcomed by the citizens in the areas that they landed. So, it's still a very dangerous game they're playing here. Made even more so by the introduction of this, the German Me-262, world's first operational jet fighter. We had nothing to compare to it. It sent shockwaves through the bomber formations. But this plane, probably could have been a game changer. I'll talk about why it wasn't a little later in the presentation. Here's some more missions that D flew in March, certainly exhausting him. Temporary duty for 7 days. I think they gave his crew a little bit of a break. Change in rank to first lieutenant, April the 12th, 1945. I believe it's at this point that D and his crew were able to go visit London. I have a few pictures I was able to find. This is Big Ben here, and this is D with a member of his crew, a young fellow named Russell O'Rourke. Here's D. There's an Abraham Lincoln statue near Parliament, which I thought was pretty neat. But there he is posing there. And his last few missions early in April, two to Royan, France, to support the French taking of this town. It was still manned by Nazi forces. Another trip to Dresden, Germany, again in support of the Soviet military machine. And, that was it. May the 8th, 1945, the war was over. D flew his last the 94th, and D flew his last combat mission in mid-April. And it wasn't, a couple weeks, war in Europe is over. VE Day, May the 8th, 1945. As Memel said, she said, D came through all that without a scratch. Little Dolores's boots were hanging in the cockpit and got all shot up, but not D. He made it through his combat missions. But his service was not finished. He continued to fly, including on July the 16th, 1945. It's called the redeployment program. D, the 94th, were part of shipping, massive amounts of material into occupied Germany. And D's mission this day was to fly in to Kaufbeuren in Germany, which was an old Luftwaffe base. And unfortunately, it was on this mission that his B-17, 448149, crashed in the Alps. This was in July the 16th, 1945. I've read the crash report. Thunderstorms, they must have, gotten lost on the way somehow, and were flying essentially in a canyon, had no idea, probably had no sight, and just ran into, crashed into the wall of a side of a mountain, just as he had dreamed as a boy. So my research focused on finding the crash or where it was and maybe the story. And just by luck, I found Wolfgang Falk, and who lives in Austria. He's an airplane archaeologist. He runs, it's called Sandy Air Corps, and they specialize in recovering really planes underwater, things like that. Wolfgang is an amazing individual. He and I corresponded a great deal about the war, about the air war, and things like that. Here you see one of his finest, I think, accomplishments. This is a lake in Austria where they salvaged the Dottie May. It's a P-47 Thunderbolt fighter, and this fighter was on the last day of the war, May the 8th, 1945. They were flying it over the area to lift the spirits of POWs in the area. And this fighter plane, I think, got too close to the lake and clipped the propeller, which caused the plane, to crash and sink and so forth, where it stayed until about 20 years ago. And Wolfgang was able to find it and help not only to bring it up and so forth, but to restore it. The Dottie May, they've totally restored it now, and it's operational today. But when I found that, I started reading a little bit more about Wolfgang and looked on YouTube and found a video, and I could not believe this, but he had been to the crash site, to D's plane's crash site. And even more amazingly, he lives just a couple miles from there. So here's Wolfgang here. I'm going to show you some of his museum shortly and all. Like I said, fantastic individual. He's a pilot. He runs Sandy Air. He runs this museum. I call him a Renaissance man. He taught art theory, and so taught here at University of New Orleans. Anything about flying, he knows it, and lives right where D's plane crashed in Austria, which I show you, the map right here. So in my correspondence with Wolfgang, he sent me this. He made this, of course, sent me this, and he said, hey, this is probably what happened. He was telling me about mountain flying and sent me this graphic and said, this is where your uncle's plane crashed, and here's the place where there are parts. I thought, parts? What do you mean there are parts there? It never occurred to me that there are parts still there, the crash site. So here, these are part of the engines, two of the engines of D's B-17 sitting there, really for almost 80 years now in the Alps. And again, when I saw that picture, I said, I've got to go see that. And lucky for me, I had a student 2 years ago that nominated me for an award, the REB Award. The Community Foundation, the REB Foundation puts this on for teachers. And if you are nominated and lucky enough to win, well, they help you make your dreams come true when it comes to educational research. This is what I have been doing. And away we went. My wife and I went over there, and I planned this whole thing out, to visit these sites. Flew into London. I had to go to see Big Ben, just like Dee did. Found the Abraham Lincoln statue. Had a picture made there. We got over to London, and got all these palaces and the kings and all that stuff. And I wanted to see where D was. You can keep all the other stuff. Well, we went to that too. But anyway, I wanted to go to places he had been, and I was able to do that just to get a feeling of what the man might have experienced while he was there. And then we took the train to Bury St. Edmunds, a small town in eastern England where Rougham Airfield is located. Beautiful place. As you can see here, this is the Angel Hotel. We were able to stay. This is where a lot of airmen stayed here during World War II. Magnificent. Across the way, there's an abbey at Bury St. Edmunds, ancient abbey that's there, and gardens and so forth. The abbey was, of course, destroyed over the hundreds of years and the Reformation and so forth, and the post-Reformation. But I spent a lot of time, walking through the abbey gardens. And the 94th Bomb Group has a monument there. And the most amazing thing, it was Armed Forces Day in England while we were there. And, there were wreaths there. All these years later, there were wreaths there at the 94th Memorial. There's one specifically to the 94th Bomb Group. Just so touching to me that those men, their service is respected to this day, the sacrifices that they made over there. before the boys came home in 45, they took, this is a wing of a B-17 they made. You can see where it's been patched from battle damage. They made a bench for the people of Bury St. Edmunds. So I sat there quite a bit and reflected on everything I was seeing. Beautiful place. This is the Abbey Gardens. I thought that was a nice picture. Just such a beautiful place. We made a side trip to Cambridge. And Cambridge is the home of the American Air Museum in Britain. And I swear they have two restored B-17s there. And you see a picture of the engines visited there. And here's D in his cockpit. And there you see a cockpit of a B-17. The museum is fantastic. But what just, really took my breath away is their roll of honor. That museum has the names of every American airman lost in World War II. Every American airman in the 8th Air Force, the ones that were there in Britain that won that war in the air, they're there, they're honored there, and they will always be honored there. And I found D's name, and it was a very touching moment for me. I just can't say how much that means that the people still honor those boys and what they gave, because they did give everything. And here, this is Rougham. This is Graham Sage, and Graham runs this museum. And this is a private enterprise. These fellows that volunteer here, they keep the place going. It's not funded in any way. They have just kind of restored it. They've made a museum there, and it's really fantastic what they do. They hold programs there all the time. Graham took me on a private tour of the entire museum. I was really blown away. This is what D would have worn when he was in the in the cockpit of the plane. You can see they're dressed for the cold, electric flight suit, because when you're at altitude in an unpressurized plane, you're talking 60 degrees below zero at 25,000 feet. If you read anything about these fellows and what they did, oftentimes a lot of them, they would have frostbite, the windows we shattered, bullet damage, and so forth. It's phenomenal. Here you see the Quonset huts. These are original Quonset huts that are still there. Obviously, if you look in the background, you can see the encroachment of the modern day. So they don't control the whole airfield anymore. But hopefully they can keep this museum going as long as possible. Inside the Quonset hut, they have a little exhibit, which is what the lads would have been, doing on their spare time. The most important of which is the stove shown here. Let me tell you, I was there. It was July. It was cold. It was rainy and damp, and I can't imagine what it would have been like there in the winter. You read about it. These guys, they say they can never get fully warm. They can never get fully dry. And this picture at the museums, you can see it. They'd be in their barracks just trying to stay warm. And you look at these guys, and you can imagine the camaraderie. But I also want you to imagine, especially depending on the year, you could send all these guys up in a mission. There's no guarantee that any of them are coming home. It was always a constant amount of turnover there, which I'm sure would be a very very scary thing for these guys to come to realize. So they have, it's a field day of the past, echoes of the past, they call it. And they open up the air base, and they have reenactors come in, and historians and vendors. And it was well attended. And I timed my trip so that I could be there for that. And it's just great to see that people really of all ages, you see the little fellas there, still honor our guys, our guys that went over there and did what they did. From there, we went to Munich, on our way to Austria. And a couple things, this is the Marienplatz at Munich, beautiful architecture and so forth. And they have a fantastic museum there where they document Munich was a hotbed of Nazism, where Hitler really got his political start. And I spent hours in the museum reading about the exhibit, and they, acknowledged that they started this aggressive war. This is a picture of the bombing of Warsaw, where the Luftwaffe bombed cities, and did the same in London, and had the same brought to them because of it later. We hiked about 3 miles. Had to go see this. This is it's an art college in Munich on the right here, and they have left the bomb damage from World War II there, right? And so that's what you're looking at, the pockmarked brick wall. That's bomb damage. Our bombers did that from World War II, and they left it there as a reminder, right? So we hopped on the train there in Munich, figured out a way to go, and headed down to Austria, passing through Kaufbeuren, which was the destination of D's bomber that fateful day, and arrived in the small town of Reutte in the Austrian Alps, right there in the middle of the mountains. You can see, I took this picture on the right. You can see the clouds and the visibility. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful area. It's just stunningly beautiful. Next day, we took the train to a little town. I think it's Austria's smallest town, Vils. It was maybe 5 miles away. And got off the train. Just the train station. It's just gorgeous. It's a little church there, the flowers. It's just stunningly beautiful. And I saw the memorial to an Austrian soldier, and this is where I think it really sunk into me on this trip. The perspective. I have always considered World War II, World War I from the American perspective. And there it is. This is the German, or Austrian in this case, perspective. And, it's good to reflect, it's terrible, wars are terrible and so forth. And there are many, many sides, to the story and the loss and everything else. I looked at that a good little while. And then I met Wolfgang. To me, this was a thrill. Okay. I've been talking to this guy online for a couple of years, and I got to say, I had really gotten a great education about reflection on the war and the air war and, and everything else from him. He's told me the story of his family and the loss of his uncles, and his father, I believe, was a prisoner of war in the United States and so forth. And meeting him was a thrill for me. And, he agreed, he told me if I ever came over, he would get me to the crash site. And, he met me there at Vils, and we're going to get out there and we're going to go up to see the crash site. And then, of course, we had to walk. So if you have a look, it was a good hike. We're in the Alps, after all. And so we did have to, to move up the mountain and walk up the mountain to get there. But it was worth every step. Was just beautiful. The mountain will go and it'll top off into a nice meadow. Austria is stunning. You look, they have signs for the paths, like road signs. Hiking is such a big thing there. And so we were hiking, and eventually we get there. And, here I am holding a piece of the plane. Again, to me, I just never realized it could even still be there. And the debris is everywhere of the plane. This is a video. I've had to mute the sound. It doesn't really work. Just to give you an idea, here's Wolfgang. He's explaining to me this is part of the wing. It's aluminum and so forth. He's saying this is part of the wing, talking about it's corrugated, it's painted, the heat-resistant paint and so forth. If you're going to go to a crash site, you got to have an airplane archaeologist with you, and I did. And he told me so much about the plane, about the site, everything. There's the engine, which I compare to the one that's been restored. There are 3 of the 4 engines there, and Wolfgang is still looking, hoping to find that 4th engine. What you see on the left, this where he believes the plane hit this area. It hit there and then settled down into where these trees are now. And here he and I are. We're up there in the trees looking for pieces. And he's telling me, hey, this was probably from the cockpit, and this is probably part of the make this the wheel landing gear or something like that. It was just unbelievable, just having that kind of insight. And here I am, again, this is where a lot of the smaller debris was, and we're just sort of picking through it. Now, bear in mind, it's been there for 80 years. And you see the growth and the snow that's been through there, but a lot of it's there. A little piece of riveting here, and the red of the 94th. Small pieces. Wolfgang believes that the glass is maybe from either some medicine the guys might have had, drinks they might have had in the cockpit, possibly because there's a great deal of it there. Possibly they had some glass in the cargo, bottles, maybe bringing something over. ceramic. He believes perhaps this was something, perhaps a coffee cup that one of the guys had in the plane with him. And I was looking, and I know it's been 80 years. I was looking for Dolores's boots, any kind of remnants of that. I didn't find it, but I looked and looked and looked. So I thought that would have been a really great thing to find. And we just looked all around and really, soaked it up. And, here's a look, heading back down the meadow and going back down the mountain after this hike. This is a hut, they call them. And they're all over the Alps. And, if you're hiking, you can stay the night, you can get a meal there, get a beer there, whatever. In July of 45, this is where the local farmers brought the bodies. The local farmers, when they heard and saw the crash, they went up the mountain and got the remains of those boys and brought them down there to await the United States Army. And I think that was just such a decent thing to do, that those guys did, and so forth. And that's the same place that they brought them all those years ago. So from there, Wolfgang took me to his museum, and if you see, this is a restored ME-262. He's done this. So down to the painting. I told you he was a Renaissance man, down to the camouflage paint scheme. He told me also the 262. Hitler insisted that this be one of his V weapons, vengeance weapons, and it would be used for bombing, bombing Britain instead of as a fighter. And the fact that Hitler wouldn't allow this to be made into a fighter is why this never became the devastating weapon that it could have been. This, again, great insight. And, Wolfgang's also restored this Fokker. This has the intermittent machine gun where it will not shoot up the propeller. And Wolfgang, not only is this restored, it's flyable. And his museum, it has things from Sandy Air and the way that they salvage aircraft. It also has aircraft innovations, jet fighter, the intermittent machine gun. He's got one of the first helicopters he's working on that he's found. I thought this was neat. This is perspective, not the best picture I took, but this is from a cockpit of a German fighter. And if you look at the film, it's a B-17. So it's the other side, right? The other side of the story in this museum, which again, it's good to expand your perspective on things. The most amazing thing and generosity of Wolfgang and Wolfgang's wife, Sandra, who I'll show you in a second, they also arranged for me to fly over the crash site. And that's what we're doing here. He took me up in a plane to show me what the boys and, what they would have experienced and talk to me about, mountain flying. Just look at the beauty of the valley there, where we flew. Again, the sound doesn't work too well, but I do want to give you an idea. Here we are flying, headed toward where D's plane would have been. You see how close we are to the mountains. But remember, when D flew there, it was during a thunderstorm, and there would have been no visibility. And so let's go to this one. This is a little bit better. You'll see the crash site. And so they're flying, and they just would have crashed right into the mountain. You're looking right there below. It's essentially where where the crash was. And you see we're making a turn there, how close we are to the mountains and all. And, the plane, there's just all the peaks and so forth. We're flying much higher than D's plane flew that day. They just didn't really have a chance, unfortunately, to get through that. But, it's beautiful country, though. I got to say, the mountains are just fantastic. Oops. So here I am with Wolfgang outside of his museum, which is just such a neat place. He's got a work area there. He runs his business out of there. It's just this beautiful place. He opens it up on the weekends and has people come in and so forth. And here's his wife, Sandra. She's working on her master's degree in archaeology, and her topic is the crash site. So I've shared my story with them as much as I could, help as much as I can on that. But just such a wonderful family, nice people, and really they made dreams come true, and I will always be grateful for that. One last look at the Lech Valley there. So anyway, back to Castlewood. Here's Memal and Hazel out on the front porch, and Memal said, this is in the summer. The war's over. We were all ready for him to come home and hope to see him any day. We were going to do so many things. she said. Then on August 5th, the family's there. It's a Sunday. Family's all there. Walt, the girls, the babies. My mom had her first child by that time as well. They're having Sunday breakfast, and that means biscuits and gravy and sausage and eggs and bacon. It's a country breakfast, and it's as good as it gets. But they're sitting there, and there's a knock at the door, and they get up and go, and it's a little girl from the train depot, and she had a telegram for Betty, Dee's wife, Betty. And Emma said she was looking at the girl and could tell by her face it wasn't good. And sure enough, Betty opened it, and Dee was gone. It said that Dee had been killed in a crash. And you look at the situation. The war was over. Dee said, he said, if you ever hear that I've been killed, don't believe it. In war, oftentimes these guys would become prisoners, and later we get word of that. But the war was over. That wasn't going to happen this time. And the news spread. The whole community came over to the Sutherland house, to visit and try to help them get through it. But it was just a devastating blow. One that Walter never got over. And it wasn't a week later. It was VJ Day. The war was over. And it was just devastating to the family. Absolutely devastating. Walter never felt satisfied. Here's 21st August 1945. This is sent to Mr. Sutherland here by the chaplain, talking about the crash and so on and so forth. I was able to locate this letter with Dee's folder. Here's one on October of 1945. Written by the commanding officer and so forth. Just following up. Must have been a hard letter to write, and it was a harder one to read. But the last paragraph says, "Such men as he will always remain in America's heart as the makers of the peace by which we are now made humble." Really, that's why I'm doing all this work. He will remain in America's heart. I think that's important. I have, done all that I could to remember my great uncle. I want to take a second, however, and reflect. We talk about the sacrifice of the soldiers, and we talk about all this, and I want to reflect on the parents for a second. Poor Walter, was a great man, and when he lost his son, he had to go on. He had to continue. He had two daughters still. He had grandchildren now, but it was hard for him. He had lost his wife. He had lost an infant daughter, a long time before to pneumonia. He lost both of his parents during the war, and then he lost his son, and his son was the apple of his eye. And poor Walter, he had to carry on, and he did. He carried on. He finished his career, and he did the best he could. But the loss that man suffered was just devastating. And when we reflect on service members and the losses of the war, it's not just about one individual. It's about the family, not just the family that raised them, but the family that comes after them. It's all tied in together. Castlewood. Castlewood. This is the old hotel in Castlewood. It's barely standing now. After the war, we had the age of the automobile and the age of the train. Well, it just died out, and with no trains coming through, Castlewood lost its purpose, economically in a lot of ways, and the mines, over time they started to close, and that whole area of the country, suffered an economic decline because of that. The age of when coal was king, it ended, and for whatever reasons it did. But when coal was king, that area of the country was exceedingly important and provided that for a nation, growing nation, for a nation at war. And then once it wasn't needed anymore, this is what happened. And Castlewood is a great example of that. The state came in, they got rid of the bridge that came into Castlewood, and that further hurt the town. Even the Sutherland farm that was eventually sold, and they put a power plant on that now. It's just the way things worked out there. But at least we have our memories of what it was back in the day, Memall's memories. Betty and Dolores, poor Betty, was a young bride and became a young widow, and stayed with the Sutherlands a while, and eventually set off out on her own. And she was able to raise Dolores into a fine woman, and Dolores had children, and I'm very, very happy to say that Dolores, her child has three grandsons, or has three sons. Those are Dee's three great grandsons. So I'm just pleased as can be that's the case. Now, the United States government, the military, they take care as best they can of their people. I think from my reading and research and so forth. This is 1952. They brought the boys home. They were buried overseas together, and years later, because of the war, they had so many things to do, to take care of. They brought the boys home together in 1952. Memall went to the service. Walter was there. Hazel, the whole family with Betty, the whole family was there for that. They brought the boys home, and they rest together now, all of them, at Zachary Taylor Cemetery there in Lexington, Kentucky. I wanted to add, and then I end with my love, your brother D. One last story. When I hiked to the crash site that very night, when I got home, I called my parents, just tell them what it was all about. And my dad, he did some research on it too, and he found a story about an identification bracelet that was found in Austria, and from a flyer. And I did the reading and so forth. It was from Dee's crash site. Other people go to that site and I guess relic hunt and so forth, and someone found this. And there's an organization called Get It Home United, and this organization found this bracelet. I suppose it would information seekers were online about it and bought it, and they returned it to the family. And that family, this is Russell O'Rourke, who was a member of the crew, young fella. And this is in the middle. This is Russell O'Rourke. This is his nephew. And this bracelet has been returned to the family. And Russell is an honored member of that family, obviously, as well. And his story, as they're buried there, there were flowers sent to that grave every year. And the local paper, they did a little investigating, and it was Russell's sister would send flowers there every year to the grave and so forth. And it's been a pleasure for me to meet Russell and to share this story, because we do share the bond of our relatives, on that crash site. So, Russell, an American hero, D as well, the whole crew, all of them are heroes, American heroes. And the men on that wall, the people on that wall, I always encourage you all, if you can, to go visit the Virginia War Memorial, have a look up there and reflect upon the sacrifice, and honor those men and women who have given their lives for our country, and as well as honor all the men and women who have and do serve our country. So that's it for my presentation. I thank you all for your attendance and for your attention. We'd be happy to answer any questions.
Hey, Jim, we do have one question in the chat right now.
Okay.
It says, hey, Jim, wow, your story and presentation were impressive, and I have lots of questions. But my number one question, how much this adventure cost you personally? Thanks, Veteran Tom House, Henrico County.
Sure. Well, all told, my grant was for $10,500, and my wife went with me. We paid for that, so out of our own pocket. So I'd say it probably cost her, her part of it probably cost about the same. So it certainly wasn't cheap, and it's something I spent 3 weeks overseas. I'd never traveled before. overseas. And of course, I've read so much about it. We were able to spend 3 weeks over there, and it's just absolutely amazing. I've been able to create this presentation thanks to the generosity, of getting the RAB grant.
Yeah, that's great. That's such an awesome award.
Yes, it surely was.
Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat. So we're just going to go ahead and just talk about just an upcoming program. But I want to thank you again for doing this presentation, put all of your hard work. I know it was a labor of love, and just awesome, awesome work.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Well, thank you to everyone for joining us today for a letter from First Lieutenant Walter D. Sutherland. And so we're going to look at the next presentation that we have coming up. And so it is right here. Join us Tuesday, February 25th at 2 p.m. for Desertion in the Military, a look back. This live stream program, hosted by Virginia War Memorial Director, Dr. Clay Mountcastle, will look back at an issue that was existed as long as our military, desertion. It is a challenge that has faced troop commanders in every war in which Americans have fought. Dr. Mountcastle will examine some examples of desertion and the methods of the U.S. military has used to deal with it. Thank you to everyone who's been listening today, learning from the home front. Previously recorded live stream programs are available at www.vawarmemorial.org/learn/resources, and learn more about our upcoming programs at www.vawarmemorial.org/events. Thank you again for everyone. Thank you to Jim, and we hope you have a terrific evening.
Thank you.